the C webinar. My name is Terry Addison. I'm an Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Southeastern Atlantic region and your host today. Before I introduce our speaker and today's topic, I have a bit of housekeeping. I'm putting the link to closed captioning in the chat box, and I will be putting the link to the webinar evaluation at the end of the presentation there as well. This evaluation will ask you if you're interested in CE from the Medical Library Association, and if you answer yes, you'll be directed to information about how to obtain that. The recording of today's webinar will be available on the NNLM YouTube channel soon, and Tony will be sending the slides out to registrants in the near future. As questions occur to you during the webinar, please put them in the chat box and our speaker will address them either during the presentation if they're pertinent or after her presentation as well. So today our speaker is Karen Viars. She is the Humanities and Science Fiction Librarian at the Georgia Institute of Technology Library, where she serves as liaison to the School of Literature, Media, and Communication. In addition to an Information Science master's degree, she holds a master's in Instructional Design and developed sales training for a Fortune 500 company before becoming a librarian. We were fortunate to have Karen present last year an introduction to instructional design, and today she will explore advanced instructional design skills and settings, including in-depth goal analysis, analyzing learners and context for the best learning outcomes, designing instruction for online learning, and addressing learner motivation and performance problems. And she relays that anyone who trains, teaches, or instructs can learn more about how to use these skills to create effective learning opportunities. And with that, I'm going to pass the ball to Karen, and she can take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. I am so happy to be back with you all for a second time to discuss instructional design beyond the basics. Thank you all for attending. I am looking forward to the conversations that we'll have during the presentation as well as after. So, as Terry mentioned, if you have questions as we're going along, I'll try to answer them. Go ahead and put them in the chat. But if I miss yours or if it's complex, then we'll circle back around and address that at the end. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at goal analysis, analyzing learners and context, designing for online learning, and addressing learner motivation, specifically focusing on performance problems. But since this is a presentation on instructional design, of course, I had to have learning objectives. So by the end of this presentation, the goal is that you'll be able to describe how to perform a goal analysis, be able to identify how to analyze learners and contexts, and name best practices for online learning, and articulate problems and solutions for performance, which can arise in workplace settings, in schools, and many other kinds of places as well. So what are some ways that you've identified instructional goals in the past? I would like to hear from our attendees today and find out what instructional goals you've identified and how that happened. If you could put your answers in the chat, please. Okay, potentially using a pre-survey. Anybody else? Yeah, talking with course instructors can be helpful too. Good, what else? I also like that one if it's a small group. If the group size allows for it, asking the group what their goals are at the beginning of class that can really help people be invested in what they're learning. That's also true. Pulling on your own experience with it as an instructor is a way to do it, for sure. Collaborating with other instructors to find out what they want students to know. Yeah, these all sound great. Okay, so let's talk about some 4 common ways that goals are selected. So we're assuming that there's been a performance problem or a gap in knowledge has been identified. And then there's 4 main ways that people tend to go about selecting instructional goals. One is using subject matter experts. You probably heard me talk about these if you listened to the previous webinar, or if you've been in circumstances where you've done work with subject matter experts before. Sometimes you'll hear people call these SMEs or SMEs, like Mr. Smee from Peter Pan, Captain Hook's sailor guy was Mr. Smee. So when with a SME, what you're assuming there is that a learner needs to know what the SME knows. Another way to do it is by a content outline, where the goal there is to provide a really broad range of information on a topic. Sometimes there's an administrative mandate. Sometimes someone says there's a problem and we're going to fix it this way. And then there's human performance technology, which is more the instructional design approach, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so if you're working with a SME, if you're working with an expert, that's a person whose knowledge of a field greatly exceeds that of the general public. Everybody is a SME about something. Many people are a SME about more than one thing. As an example, if you hold a degree in something, then that makes you a SME, whether that's Russian studies or English literature or chemistry. You can also become one through experience or study on your own. A lot of people pick up skills in the workplace, for example, that they didn't necessarily formally study, but they have a strong grasp and understanding of. So SMEs are often trying to replicate their knowledge for students. They tend to use words like know and understand about information, which can be a limitation when you're trying to develop a really clear learning objective, but certainly something you can work with. This approach assumes that students need to know what the SME knows, and it focuses on transfer of information from the SME to the learner. Content outline approach here works on the assumption that there's a performance problem because the learner hasn't learned the right kind or enough of the necessary information, and that the solution is more information. So sometimes that means that there are content standards that aren't relevant anymore or that don't address organizational needs, and those are how training decisions and goals are made. An example would be a mandatory training course for new employees on an outdated employee handbook. So this approach also tends to assume that more training is the answer to a performance problem, which is sometimes true and sometimes not. We will talk more about that as we go along today. Then with the administrative mandate, sometimes a person, a board, an agency, a supervisor, or another authority sees a performance problem and decides that training needs to happen and what the content will be. So these can include really valid and important goals, such as training that's required by law, by union contract, by safety regulations, to maintain accreditation, and so on. The danger with this approach is that sometimes the authority who's mandating the training doesn't have the insider experience to know whether training will address the actual or perceived problem. And last, instructional design favors an approach called human performance technology, where there's no real preconceived ideas about the right solution to a performance problem. Maybe training is the solution, maybe something else is the solution. If training is the right course, then it's developed in response to opportunities and problems within an organization and could include a wide range of information and approaches to performance problems. Now, ideally, that's how it works. It's usually a mix of these things. So once you've identified an instructional goal, then what? So we're going to talk about some in-depth analysis. The first question to ask yourself, and I'm quoting the work of Dick and Carrie here, who wrote an instructional design book that I've got on a slide at the end with a lot of other references. They say, what exactly would learners be doing if they were demonstrating that they could already perform the goal? Or, as a really excellent instructional designer I used to work with would say, what does right look like? If they're doing it right, what does right look like? It's important to note that this question is focused on doing rather than knowing, that it's more a behavioral rather than a cognitive goal. So let's look at some examples. So each of these could be the starting point for an instructional program. So our next question is, and again I'm quoting, how do we determine what skills must be learned in order to achieve these goals? It helps to start by sorting a goal into a broader category. And these categories are called domains of learning. They were developed by Gagne. He's one of the major figures of instructional design theory. There are 5 of them. We're going to talk about 4 in detail with these, and then a little bit about the 5th one, which isn't as relevant to what we're doing today. So the ones we're going to talk about are verbal information, intellectual skills, psychomotor skills, and attitudes. There's one that fits each of those 4 domains on the slide here. So which do you think is which? You go ahead and put your answers in the chat. In case it's helpful, I'll repeat them. Verbal information, intellectual skills, psychomotor skills, and attitudes. Yeah, you guys are absolutely right. Good job. Okay, webinar's over. I know, we'll continue. But you have definitely seen how these fit into these domains. So let's talk about each of them in a little bit more detail. Okay, so this one is the verbal information one. You're correct in that. This is declarative knowledge. Verbal information is facts, names, locations. It's a specific response where there's really only one right answer to a specific question. So mostly when you're looking for people to learn this kind of information, it's a matter of memorizing and helping them memorize. So what you want to investigate is the best way to do that for your learners and the kinds of information that they need to know. So maybe if it's a lot, you break it up into smaller pieces. Maybe if it's only a few things, then that's something that you could expect to take less of your instructional time. But the goal here is to help people remember these specific things, to help get that into their long-term memory so they can use it to do other things. All right, this one is the intellectual skills goal. So an intellectual skill is focused on procedural knowledge, how to do things, essentially. There are 5 subdomains, and these go in increasing order of complexity. The first one is discrimination, which is the ability to differentiate objects from each other based on their characteristics, features, or dimensions. So that's being able to tell the difference between a cat and a dog, for example. A lot of this is stuff that you'll see young kids doing and learning. Reinforcement and repetition are helpful with that. Concrete concept, which is the next one, is the ability to identify an object as similar to other objects to organize and group things based on common characteristics, features, attributes, things like color or shape or position. So for example, that would be something like, based on all of its qualities, is a bell pepper a vegetable? So learning concrete concepts is a little more complex than learning discrimination. You really just, for the previous one, need to understand the difference. And when you are working with concrete concepts, you need to identify an object correctly based on its properties. So for instance, a triangle is a triangle regardless of what color it may be. But if you're sorting them by things that are in different groups, then more than one factor, such as shape and color, will come into play. So the third one is defined concept, which is the ability to understand what an object or an event or a relationship means. So that's stuff like, what does the word family mean? What is the concept of justice or community or mass or acceleration, if you want to take it into the sciences? So these are more abstract. With concrete concepts, we're definitely dealing with physical things that we can see and touch. And with defined concepts, we're dealing with things that are more nebulous and harder to explain. So it's a higher kind of level of understanding. So with these, helping people to understand the relationships among the components of a concept is important. So sometimes a demonstration or a film on how a concept works can be a helpful way to help people learn. So a rule is the next one, and that's the ability to understand the relationships among objects and events or concepts. So knowing how to multiply, that includes a rule. So these numbers behave in certain ways based on mathematical rules. So communicating the rule clearly is really important. So helping people recall the components that make up the rule and how the relationships within the rule work, and then providing guidance during learning is usually important during this. And then problem solving is the last one and the most complex, and that's what we're looking at here. So problem solving is the ability to combine different rules to solve a problem. An algebraic equation is going to have several different mathematical rules involved in it. So first of all, having a good understanding of the relevant rules and information, and then helping people go through the process, guided or unguided, of solving problems that are similar to the kinds of problems that you want them to solve themselves after they've completed this learning. It's all important. All right, our next one is psychomotor skills, and I picked this example because it doesn't necessarily immediately suggest itself as a psychomotor skill, but it is. So a psychomotor skill is a sequence of motor responses or movements, and these are combined into complex psychomotor performances. So they're best learned through repeated practice. Our goal here is to set up and operate the camera. Knowing how the camera works isn't really important. Cinematography is completely outside the scope of our goal here. Our goal here is simply to set up and perform the movements of setting up the camera and operating the camera. So some other examples might include learning how to pirouette and ballet dancing, skateboarding, learning how to write with a writing instrument like a pen, or if you decide to learn calligraphy, that's a good example as well. So you can learn individual parts of a skill like this called sub-skills and practice those individually. Dance is a good example of this. And then sequence or combine them. And that's a good way to learn a psychomotor skill. All right, our last one is about attitudes. And attitudes are more complicated. An attitude is an internal state affecting personal choices and actions. So attitudinal goals are the winning hearts and minds kinds of goals. And they're measurable mostly by observing someone's choices or behaviors. So sometimes you'll see self-reported questionnaires as a common way to evaluate whether those have made an impact on learners or not. So you can use reinforcement to encourage a desired behavior or value or choice. An appealing and credible role model can be helpful in these situations, especially if you can help to communicate a sense of satisfaction from making these kinds of choices. So this is one example of an attitudinal goal, but other ones are things like you hope that people will decide to be good employees, or that they will contribute to a charitable campaign that your organization is involved in, or other things of that nature. All right, so our last one is called cognitive strategies, and this is essentially metacognition, so thinking about thinking. And it includes ways that we think about things that we're learning and ways that we assure our own learning. So an example of a simple cognitive strategy would be when you meet somebody new and you mentally repeat their name several times so that you can try to remember their name in association with their face. The next time you see them, hopefully, then you will remember and be able to call them by name. A more complex one would be figuring out how to organize, remember, and apply information from a textbook chapter, for instance, for an upcoming test. So being able to think about how you're going to do your studying in a way that is going to best enable you to learn is an example of a more complex metacognitive strategy. Okay, so now we're going to talk about analyzing learners in context. We've talked about goals, and why do we analyze learners in context? What's the value in doing that? If you could put your thoughts on this in the chat, I'm curious to hear what you think. Taking into account their experiences, yeah. Adjusting teaching strategies, yep. To see how much they know coming in. Yeah, to see what level they're at of understanding, among other things. How best to convey the information, that's a good idea, yeah. To make the learning relevant, yeah, ultimately that's what we're trying to do. Ultimately that's the goal. So making the learning that they're going to be doing here and their time and their investment of energy and attention relevant. So when an instructional designer, based on previous analysis, decides what needs to be taught and then analyzes the characteristics of the learners, then you also need to know about the context for the learning environment and the context in which the skills will be performed. So knowing about the learners is important. Knowing where you're going to be doing the instructing and where they're going to be performing the skills that they've learned also influences the instruction. So what we want to know is, who are the learners? What do they know? We'd call these the learners for an intended instructional program. We call them the target population for the instruction. Ideally, there are going to be some members of the target population available to talk to and to get them to try out the instruction as it's being developed. You can use interviews, surveys, and questionnaires. You can observe the learners. You can use published information about them, although that's going to be more generic than about your specific group of learners. You can read documents and artifacts created by them. So if they've previously done, for example, some work on what the skill you want to teach them, then you have the opportunity to review those documents or whatever resulted from that learning. Then that's going to be a helpful way to find out where they are in their skill level. So mainly what we want to do is determine what are called entry behaviors. Like, what do they already know how to do? What do we not need to spend time teaching them how to do? What their prior knowledge of a subject is generally. It's helpful to know their attitudes toward the content and toward the instructional delivery system. If you have a group of people who, for whatever reason, really just don't like classroom learning, they want to learn online, or if it goes the other way and they'd really like to have that face-to-face interaction and they don't like learning online, that's going to be helpful to know. If they come in with an already sort of predetermined bad attitude about the content, based on maybe a previous bad experience or something else, that's going to help too, because you're going to need to build something about that into your instruction to help hopefully get past it. So you also want to know how motivated they are. How inherently or intrinsically motivated are they to learn this stuff? Like, are they interested just on their own merits, or are they just doing this because they have to? That can help to influence say how often you're going to check in with them with feedback. You want to know their education and ability level so that you're not trying to teach something that's way too complex to folks who just aren't yet at a point in their education or ability where that's going to be helpful to them. So general learning preferences are helpful too. Do they want group work? Do they like group work? Would they rather absolutely do anything but group work? Those are helpful things for you to know as you're thinking about designing. And then just general group characteristics. So how similar are they to each other on important variables such as ability level or prior knowledge? And how will your instruction account for that? Those are the questions that you need to ask yourself. And the goal here is certainly not to devolve into stereotyping or not to meet the needs of everybody, but to understand how similar the group is within itself so that you can account for the differences as well as the similarities. Here are some ways that learner analysis affects design. This is from the work of Smith and Reagan. It is especially valuable to help learners see how the instruction is valuable to them, to help them and encourage some intrinsic interest and motivation. So how fast you're going to be teaching, how many practice activities you have. We were just talking about relevancy a moment ago to help people see that this is relevant to them. The techniques you use for gaining and focusing attention are going to be very different if you have a group of 15-year-olds versus if you have a group of, say, folks who are in their 50s versus, say, a group of kindergartners. The context of examples and practice activities will also be different. If you're teaching in the higher ed environment, which I do, then the scope of your examples is going to be different than if you're teaching, say, managers who work in a corporate environment or doctors who work in a hospital. The amount of structure and organization is also going to depend heavily. Typically, older learners are often more self-directed. It's not always true, but typically. How much feedback to give, that can also be affected by other things, but how much feedback to give can depend a lot on your learners. How much they're in charge of what happens depends a lot on your learners. The vocabulary level of your materials, what kinds of reinforcement and rewards are appropriate, the amount of time that you're going to give them to complete things, the amount of guidance that they would need, and then how concrete or abstract you need to be when you are providing examples or even just in the material that you would choose to cover. So once you've analyzed the learners and you know as much about them as you can find out, the next thing is to think about analyzing your learning and performance contexts. So typically what we're looking at today would be a face-to-face environment, like perhaps a classroom, an online environment, and those can vary quite a lot, synchronous or asynchronous, learning management systems which can provide spaces where students can upload materials or have forum discussions, as well as synchronous kinds of softwares like what we're using right now. And then there's also hybrid classes, which meet face-to-face some of the time and online some of the time, and have sort of the best and worst of both worlds there. So for the learning context, you're going to need to know, regardless of what it is, whether that's face-to-face, online, or both, how compatible is it with what you need to teach people? For instance, this classroom in this photograph would be fine for something that's fairly straightforward, like if you wanted to teach a class on collection development, this would probably be fine. But if you needed to teach ER doctors how to do, let's see, a CPR class, this probably isn't ideal because you're going to need more space, you're going to need people to move around, you're going to need people to be getting up and down off the floor. There's not a ton of space in here for that, so that would be a problem. You're going to want to think about its ability to simulate the performance context, because the closer that you can get to the circumstances in which people will actually be doing the things you're teaching them to do, the easier it's going to be for them to make that transfer of skills. So again, you're going to want to think about how close your space can come to that. You're also going to want to think about adaptability of delivery approaches. Like if you're in a position where you can only teach with all of the desks facing in one direction, using a projector, and a podium, that's going to be limiting in some ways. If the furniture, for instance, doesn't move around, it's going to make small group work potentially more challenging. These are all things to consider as you're making these choices, in as much as you have choice about this. Sometimes you're within fixed circumstances and you work with one of the options that are available to you. For the performance context, some things that really help people use the skills that they develop when they're in training would be managerial support for using the new skills. So having somebody who's going to be saying, yes, use the stuff you've learned, that's what we want to see, that's really helpful, as well as understanding the physical and social aspects of the place where this will happen. So if you teach somebody how to do something, but they don't have the same space that they need to do it in their job or in whatever circumstances you want them to use the skills, they probably aren't going to. If there's something about the culture of the place where they are with a group of students, say, or with colleagues, where they think that using these skills will make them not as much a part of the group, it's also unlikely that they're really going to be using them. You also want to consider the relevance of the skills to what you want them to do and to the kind of circumstances they're in. It's not going to be helpful to train somebody to do something that they're never going to do again. It's not really useful for them. It's not really useful for the organization. So a quote here from Smith and Reagan that I feel like really sums up the main danger of skipping over learning about your learners. So we need to remember that people aren't all alike, that instruction can account for that, but needs to take the time to do that. And that more importantly, the learners probably aren't identical to the designer. So that's all stuff that's important to keep in mind. All right, how many of you have had an online learning experience, besides this one that we're having right now? How many of you had an online learning experience, and what made it a good experience or a bad experience? Was it successful or unsuccessful, and why? I'd like to hear about your thoughts in the chat. Yes, so you're talking about access to the instructor, interactivity and engagement. Yeah, if somebody doesn't mute their phone, that can be a real problem. Noise can create a problem in an online learning environment or a synchronous session. Responsiveness is very important. You guys are pointing out stuff that comes up in the literature a lot. Clear expectations are also very important. And trying to cover too much, I think, is a particular danger in the online environment because the instructor doesn't have that real-time feedback of how the learners are responding. And it can be a difficult thing to try to communicate over email or another asynchronous form of communication. Okay, great. Well, we're going to move to talking some about, we've talked about analyzing learners and context, analyzing goals, but now we're going to move some to talking about online learning. And with online learning, the instructional design stuff that was in the previous webinar and that we've covered so far, all of that's still true. You still need to know these things. You may have some additional challenges with analyzing your learners in online environments simply because you're not able to meet with them face-to-face or observe them in that way. So that's a case where maybe doing some surveys, some questionnaires ahead of time can help you learn about them in a self-reported kind of way. So a couple other things that can help. And again, you had already really picked up on this. Asking students to respond is a really good way to help people stay engaged and involved. So attention is always important in learning. It is essentially the bedrock of learning. Without it, learning doesn't happen. And it's especially important in the online environment since the instructor doesn't have visual clues as to how a learner is doing with picking up the content or remaining involved in what's happening. So building in interactivity is a great way to keep people engaged. For instance, today I'm asking a lot of questions because I'm interested in you and in your experience, and also to help keep your attention in what we're talking about. Okay, so this slide is terrible, isn't it? What do you guys see wrong with this? Go ahead and tell us in the chat. Yeah. So there's not enough contrast between some colors, too much contrast between other colors, all caps, overuse of punctuation. Yeah, that's a lot of exclamation points. It does look aggressive. Yeah, the yellow background is kind of retina searing. So yeah, there are a lot of problems here. There, isn't that better? Let's look at this other slide that's just got very simple black and white text on it. So what we're talking about here is cognitive load. And the previous slide was to illustrate the point about cognitive load, that when there's too much going on or you're making a human brain work too hard, that things tend to get lost. That it's hard to take the information that was in the working memory and encode it in the long-term memory and have it be available to retrieve later. So cognitive load, the definition is the amount of effort a learner's working memory is doing. And it's important in all learning, but it's especially important in online learning where there are temptations to do things like have bad slide design or overwhelm people with multimedia. So the more extraneous information that a brain has to process, then the harder it is to make sure the important stuff can stick around. So this has a significant effect on the ability to learn. Another example would be, and this is just something that I've seen happen in my personal experience, I don't have any kind of meaningful conversation in a sports bar because there's so many televisions around, and I'm so distracted by the moving pictures and the sounds that I don't remember the conversations I have with the friends or family that I'm with. Other people may have similar circumstances where they've had that happen. So that's an example of how the working memory just doesn't move things to the long-term memory when there's a whole lot of other things that are taking up processing space. Yes, I see a request to repeat the definition. So cognitive load is the amount of effort that a learner's working memory is doing to process incoming information. And if some of that effort is spent on things like trying to differentiate really light-colored text on an obnoxiously yellow background, then it's taking up space doing that instead of focusing on the content. I would imagine that if I gave you guys a quiz on what was on that slide, it'd be hard to remember a lot of the specifics because you're so distracted by everything else going on. All right, so another thing to talk about is divided attention. So online learning has an unlimited range of options for distraction. There's a whole wide internet out there. Not to mention smartphones, noise nearby, family members, pets, colleagues who drop by with a question. There are many, many things that can distract people who may be participating in online learning. And this seems incredibly simple, but it's true. One of the best ways to improve this is simply by asking people to focus. So if you just say, please put away your distractions, try to make sure you're doing your classwork or your online learning or your seminar or whatever it is at a time when you won't be disturbed and you can give it your full attention, that really makes a difference. That can help people realize that this is something that they have to focus on in a way differently perhaps than they do when they're just surfing the web or doing some online shopping or something similar. So again, instructional design in and of itself really translates well to the online environment. In addition to the things we've already talked about, there's a few other specific recommendations. So multimedia is a really good way to replace what would be a traditional lecture in a classroom or in training. You can use written content, you can use recorded lectures, you can have videos of experts talking about a topic, you can have narrated animations, PowerPoint slides, and those can come with or without voiceover narration, forum posts and responses, synchronous sessions like what we're doing here for a lecture or Q&A, directed writing assignments and discussion. There's educational games and simulations. There's a whole lot of stuff. And therein also lies the danger. Choose the stuff that's really going to help but not tip over into being too much. So that can be a fine line to walk, like how much is too much, and that may be a thing to experiment with. But I would say err on the side of less is more when it comes to multimedia. As you all highlighted, communicating regularly is particularly important. I did my master's degree in information sciences from the University of Tennessee online, and they did a really good job of helping us create a community. And having communication regularly from the instructor is a way to make online learning feel less lonely. It's also really important to provide feedback about progress because people don't know how they're doing if they don't get that. And it's, again, especially true in the online environment. And then picking technologies that work for you. A technology is valuable not inherently, but in what it can do to help you achieve learning. So just because it is a new thing or because it's something that's been successful elsewhere, I wouldn't necessarily say it's always going to be a good fit unless you know for sure that it's going to help achieve the learning objectives that you've set out. Okay, so let's talk about motivation and performance problems. Think about a time that you observed a performance problem at work or somewhere else. What do you think was the cause? Would you tell us in the chat? Communication or lack of communication? Lack of confidence in a particular skill. Yeah, sometimes the person may not feel that it's important. No clear expectations, no timeline, distractions from other things. Too many initiatives can also be a problem. Sometimes it's hard to divide your attention effectively. All right, thank you guys. So a lot of times when there's a problem with performance, the initial thought is that there's a problem with attitude, and that may be true, but it may also not be true. So in most cases, further investigation is warranted, like our Lego Sherlock Holmes here. You need to be a detective, finding the clues about why there's a gap in the performance. So here are some possible causes for why there are performance problems. So confusion about expectations, I think, is more often than not a major culprit, more than people like to think. It's usually a great place to start with making sure that expectations are clear. Then sometimes people don't have what they need to perform. They also may not realize there's a discrepancy between what they're doing and the desired performance, so they figure what they're doing is fine. If there's zero feedback about anything that happens, then people tend to say, well, okay, I guess everything's all right. On the other hand, if there's a reward for doing it wrong or a punishment for doing it right, people are going to continue probably to do those things. And if someone's performance isn't up to expected levels and nothing really happens, or that it's over expected levels and nothing really happens, then that can lead to a sense that it doesn't really matter what they're doing or not doing. So none of these things can be addressed through training. I feel like it's important to point that out. None of these things can be fixed by training. But the last two can be. The first several are largely management issues, but the last two bullet points can be helped by training. For the first one, when someone used to know how to do something, but they've forgotten some details, then it's important to start with their current skill level. So if you think about like a neighborhood that you used to live in or a city that you used to live in, but you haven't been there in a while, like if you had to drive around, like you sort of know where things are, but you probably make some mistakes or take a wrong turn. But you don't need to start with learning a map of the city from scratch because there's some basic knowledge there. Training's a good fit for a case where somebody has a skill that they don't have at all and they need to acquire. So what are some ways to fix these problems if these are the problems that are causing performance? performance discrepancies. Oh, yeah, I like the idea of a training aid. I've also seen this called job aids or cheat sheets. It's sort of a summary of what you need to do the work. Yeah, making things relevant to people's works, clarifying expectations. Yep. Sometimes retraining is important. Providing handouts before session or after? I think it depends. It depends on what you're planning to cover in the session and what you want the purpose of the handout to be, to summarize what was in the session or to provide additional information beyond what's in the session. If it's to summarize what's in the session, it can be helpful at the beginning, but if it's to provide information beyond what's in the session, then it's more helpful at the end when people have some basis of knowledge. If it's both, that's a good question. You could divide it up, and then I would say put it at the end. If there's going to be information that's supposed to build on what's in the session, I would say give it at the end, because it can be confusing if you start out without a baseline of knowledge, and then you've got a handout with even more knowledge that's unfamiliar to you. Okay, so some possible solutions. You guys were totally on track to clarify expectations. If they don't have what they need to do the job, then provide some resources, provide consistent feedback. If somebody's being punished for doing it right, if they turn in their budget reports on time every month, but then a department head from a different department yells at them about competing for resources, they're probably going to stop. If there's a way to keep that from happening, then it's going to encourage the behavior that is preferred. Removing rewards for wrong behaviors. Providing or reconfiguring consequences for behavior. If there's no consequences at all, then that might be the place to start. If somebody's doing a really great job, then simply taking them out to lunch and saying, you're doing awesome, keep it up, everybody's noticed. That can be pretty motivating. Also, and this is something that's just come up over in the chat, breaking a task into its smaller parts, simplify things. If something's really complex, then say, we're going to do this in pieces, and maybe it'll be a process that takes longer. If there's other obstacles to performance that are outside of these, just sort of think about what those could be. And then maybe doing training. Maybe training is the answer. All right, so once you've identified the cause of a performance problem and considering some possible solutions, but in between those two, you want to also think which of these problems are worth solving, because there are probably going to be more than are actually solvable. So it's always worth asking, what happens if we don't do anything? Like, what happens if we just leave it alone? If the answer is serious consequences would occur, then yes, clearly that's something that needs to be addressed. If it just means that one person is annoyed, it might not be. It's also worth asking, what if we succeeded in making this change? And is that going to cause problems? Because it sometimes can be a cascade. So, for instance, if the issue is that people don't turn in their collection development requests on time, but if they did, ordering all the books at once would exceed the budget, it's actually more expensive to fix that problem. And it's probably annoying that people aren't turning stuff in on time, but it would create a bigger problem to fix it than to leave things as they are. So once you can see that the benefits are clear, if the discrepancy is fixed, that's going to be the time to act. And we're just about wrapping things up here, just in time for about 10 minutes of questions. Some recommended resources, I used these in developing this presentation, and I've used them consistently over time. I really enjoy and recommend all of these. So several of them are instructional design books, the one by Dick and Carey, and the one by Smith and Reagan. Tenet is the psychology book that also touches on motivation. If you're really looking for performance problem analysis, though, Mager and Pipe is the way to go, analyzing performance problems. And then Miller is a more recent book, Minds Online, which is teaching effectively with technology, and I would also really recommend that. So I would be happy to answer any questions that you have in our remaining time.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was so informative and really great. While everybody is thinking of their questions, I'm going to post the link for the MLACE certificate and the webinar evaluation. And I'd also like to make a quick plug for our December 6th Beyond the Sea. My colleague Nancy Patterson will be hosting a webinar on librarians and the outreach they're doing in support of the opioid crisis.
Yes, I will go back to our first question is, can we show the recommended resources again? Yes. And by the way, the slide is at the end, but this whole presentation is licensed under Creative Commons, so as long as you provide attribution and non-commercial and share alike, then you're welcome to use any of it. So this will also be sent to you if you registered and then posted for people to take a look at too. Where are the PowerPoint slides? My understanding is those would be emailed to you later.
That's correct. Tony will send that out in the near future to registrants.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, that's a really good one. Should a curriculum be customized by classroom teaching style? Can you tell me a little bit more about what classroom teaching style means here? Online versus face-to-face. Yeah, I think you do need to take some different things into consideration. So if you're going to be teaching online, then you're going to need to think about how am I going to be building in ways for people to interact in a way that would happen more organically. Well, hopefully organically. We've all sat in silent classrooms before, but in a way that can often happen more organically in a face-to-face classroom. It's just something to be more deliberate about, to try to create ways to keep people involved and engaged, and hopefully to feel like they have a sense of community the way that you would feel in a face-to-face classroom when things are really going well. So yes, I would say that it should, and that's going to help people learn better.
All right.
Any other questions?
If there's no further questions, I just want to thank you again, Karen, and thanks to everyone for attending today, and we really appreciate it. And thank you,
all
Tony.
of you for coming.
And thank you, Tony. He is posting the link to Karen's first webinar she did for us, and then Tony put the information there about our YouTube page. And thanks to Tony for all his help today, and our team of closed captioning and everybody else. And thanks for putting up with my scratchy voice. And thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.